also transcribing. Very clever.
That is clever.
Yeah. Hi, Allan. It's really, really good to meet you.
You as well. Thank you so much. Yeah.
And we're having this conversation as part of my master's in family therapy that I'm doing at the moment. And so this has helped me with my dissertation, which is on acts of resistance and thinking about how those are constructed in family therapy.
Okay.
And I came to the topic you asked before we came on record, how I came to be interested in this, what my connection is. And I'll ask you the same question in a moment.
Right.
But I think for me, there's a few things. Some of it is family and personal stories and cultural stories. As a Jewish person, as a woman, and just kind of thinking through family histories of survival and of kind of staying human in human conditions. What that takes and what it means to notice that and to see that and value that rather than just seeing the inhumanity around them. But also I've been working in children's services for the last 11, 12 years.
Right.
And doing a mixture of different types of roles there. But I've seen some really awful things happening to families, in families, by the state that I work for. And at times I've looked at the ways that we're working and felt like they're not helping.
Right.
And so that's part of what led me to seek out other ways of working.
Sure.
And I got really excited when I came across response-based practice, other types of practices that really look at resistance and honor that and value that. And I felt that sort of chiming that, like, yes, this aligns with my values. This makes sense. It's meaningful. And yet in practice, I find myself sometimes clumsy or rushing into trying to kind of share these insights in ways that aren't fitting for families. And so that was why I thought, okay, let me talk to some people who are really experienced in this, who've thought about this a lot, whose reading I found moving and helpful. And let me see how it is to have a conversation with them, if that helps expand my thinking or some of the things that I'm getting stuck on. I hoped that maybe my newness might invite something different into conversations that I'm sure you've had many, many times.
Okay.
So that was my thinking.
Okay. And how many of these conversations with folks have you had so far?
Yeah, so I did one pilot that was with a mentor for me, a research mentor. He hasn't published lots on the topic, which everyone I've asked for one of the dissertation conversations has, but he's thought a lot about it, and he's just been a wonderful mentor to me. So I had that as a first, and then I've spoken to Vicky and Shelley already.
Okay. All right. Well, you've got a good start.
Yeah, a really good start. Lots of things already going around for me.
And who else are you planning to speak with?
I am going to speak to Kathy, who I will work with, and then in the UK, I'm going to speak to Gail Simon and Taiwo Afuape.
Okay.
So that's those are my 6.
All right.
Which feels like an amazing gift that everybody said yes.
Well, it's a good idea.
I'm glad you think so.
Yeah, it's a good idea to talk to people about this kind of thing, isn't it? Right? To dig into it, put it into context, make sense of it, see how it relates to you professionally and personally.
Yeah.
And raising some other good questions and some doubts and concerns and getting other ideas for how you can follow things up. Yeah.
Yeah. It's through talking that I learn best. So
yeah.
But I'd try it.
Cool. And you're going to put it into some kind of a document.
Yeah.
Called a thesis or a dissertation.
I'm not quite sure how I'm going to do that stage of this.
Yeah.
But we'll work that out. I feel like it will emerge from these conversations. And
Yeah, by the time you get to the end of them, then certain themes will be standing out to you.
Yeah. there's already some things that I'm noticing or thinking that's, I
Sure.
wonder a bit more about that.
Right. Okay.
We can talk about some of those as well, but I'd love also for you to tell me a bit about yourself and how and when the concept of resistance became important to you.
Well, I'm your garden variety sort of small town kid from Canada who fell into this line of work accidentally, having lapsed from school teaching, and I fell into youth work. I was a school teacher for a while, but neglected to take into account that being a school teacher meant I would have to work in schools, which continued. They still give me the willies. I didn't have fun in school. I didn't like it, and didn't do well at it. But I wanted to coach kids in sports because that's kind of how I got through life. And so I had an idea about doing that. But then when I taught for a little while, I didn't like it very much at all. And when my partner Kathy and I moved to where we are now, we live now on Vancouver Island on the traditional unceded territory of Coetson First Nation. And Coetson means people of the warm land, by the way.
Okay.
Anyway, so I ended up in youth work and met some people working with kids who'd been kicked out of school. So it felt very much like they were my peeps, if you know what I mean. And I was in my mid-20s. And so that goes back a ways. And there were some people doing that work, my colleagues who were more experienced than me, who I really, really liked and admired. I liked how they thought about the young people. They were real sort of, not cheerleaders, I wouldn't say that, but they really made good relationships. They valued the kids very highly. And so they were great mentors in that regard. And I left that job and worked in alcohol and drug programs for a little while, and did a little bit of child protection work. And at some point started getting headaches quite a bit because I was ending up working with people in ways that I didn't like very much. You might have a sense of what I'm talking about. And then
I don't know if it's the same,
yeah. So, and then I was working with young people, a lot of young people, and then there's a guy moved to our town who's a psychiatrist, a guy called Robin Routledge, and who's still here, and we're good buddies and good friends still 35 years later. And he had been training in family therapy, and he'd been training with Boscolo and Chikeen, the original Milan team. So I had this really challenging situation come up with a young man I was working with. I didn't know what to do at all. It was around violence, and so I went up to the local mental disease center. They call it a mental health center, but I went up there and I asked if I could talk to the local psychiatrist, and he happened to be new in town. So, and he had a few minutes spare, so we started talking, and he asked me all these kinds of now I see them as, really systemic, interactional, relational kinds of questions, but they were completely new to me. And so I was just sort of thunderstruck and mesmerized and hypnotized, and I had no idea what had just happened. So I went back a week later and said, "What happened?" These questions you were, it's kind of like, where are you from and all this. So I just got curious, and then we ended up talking, and then other people joined, and we made a group, and called Nemo, and then ultimately called the Orca Society, and then we started inviting people to come and do trainings, and so to our tiny little town here on Vancouver Island. And so Bosco and Chikeen and Lynn Hoffman and Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kimberg and Michael White and Alan Jenkins and Imelda McCarthy and Nolik Byrne, if you can believe it. And other folks, Bonnie Burstow, other folks came to our area and just gave fantastic training. And so that was my introduction to systemic thinking. And then I had moved down south from Prince Rupert, which is up on the West Coast. All of the kids in my class when I was a teacher were Indigenous kids. And I realized toward the end of that period of time that I had no idea who they were and no idea who I was actually in relation to them, and started noticing that I had been lied to rather massively in my colonial education. And I went back to my original high school history textbooks and read the lies, and they were just so blatant and so obvious when you look back on them. So with a colleague, guy called Nick Todd, Nick and I had grown up together in a small town called Chilliwack. And Nick and I started talking about what I would now call colonial discourse. That is the way in which Europe has produced its others. And of course, the DSM and the mental health systems that have been the prevalent mental health systems, the prevalent diagnostic systems, are very much a part of the colonial enterprise. And so that was my real first. And at the same time, I was meeting with Indigenous people, beginning to meet with Indigenous people who had been abducted from their families and put into prison camps, called residential schools, euphemistically. And so I began to hear from some of those folks about how they had responded to certain things. At first, accidentally. I didn't know, but I started to hear things that just sort of changed my DNA. And I had no real way of making sense. So I started talking to my colleagues about it, Linda Coates, Nick Todd, my supervisor, Janet Babelis at that time, now deceased, Robin, Dan McGee, a number of other people, about trying to make sense of certain things, and then started reading Liz Kelly's work, who's an English feminist sociologist, as you probably know. And so she wrote her thesis, 1988, was Surviving Sexual Violence. And in that thesis, she talks about resistance, or is it coping, or is it consequences, or what are the differences between these things? Then I found James Scott's book, 1990, Domination and the Arts of Resistance. And then one thing started to lead to another. And I found that although there was at that time virtually no literature in the helping professions about how people spontaneously resist violence, there was a literature outside the helping professions, in ethnography, in history, in memoir and autobiography, in social realist fiction, in Eric Blair, Orwell, for example, but in the Caribbean resistance movement, in the Harlem Renaissance movement. So I found that there in fact is a quite massive literature on the ways in which people resist violence. And Svetsan Todorov, I ran across his book in 1992, 93 on the ways in which Jewish prisoners in Nazi concentration camps had resisted and worked to retain their humanity and so forth. So it turns out there's this massive literature on how people respond to and resist violence. Very little of it had penetrated the helping professions at that time, which of course raises all kinds of other interesting questions. So that was kind of the starting point for me. And then doing microanalysis of face-to-face communication was quite decisive, because in social interaction, people respond to one another. It's not a cause-effect situation, so to speak. People are exchanging gestures and differences in intonation and gaze and posture, and while they're talking and taking turns and talking together to produce a story, etc. So when you're looking at social interaction in detail, doing microanalysis, you ask questions about how people respond to one another. So suddenly I started to kind of think, okay, if I use that language and I ask questions about responses, and once I started doing that, I started getting very different accounts from people than asking about the impacts and the effects. So those were kind of the main factors, I suppose, that sort of kind of got me going down this track, as it were. And then, of course, I talked with Imelda McCarthy. Imelda was on my PhD committee. And so we had very important conversations to me about all of this. So I was hooked up to some really interesting, supportive people. Steve DeShazer and Insoo Kim Berg were incredibly generous and encouraging me. Yeah, there's something here you really need to pursue. And so I got a lot of encouragement from people I admired, which of course always helps.
I'm thinking back. So there's something in you or something in your history that made you sort of notice those things or wake up to those things. You said you suddenly realized with those students of yours that you didn't know them.
Mm-hmm.
There's something that you had to understand, and then you looked back and found all those lies and could recognize them as lies in a way that was obvious at that. Where do you think that came from for you, that noticing or recognizing that something?
Well, there were experiences when I was a teacher in Prince Rupert, one in particular that a story I tell a lot, which is sitting in the staff room with one of my colleagues on Meet the Creature night, when the parents of the kids in your class are supposed to come in and meet the teacher. And none of the parents for the kids in my class showed up. They're all Indigenous kids. And I'm sitting in the staff room with my buddies, having a smoke as you did in 1981 in the staff room, that kind of a thing. And where the heck are these parents? Like, don't they care about the kids? What's going on? And having been raised in a profoundly colonial racist society, I mean, I was raised in a small town. There were lots of Indigenous folks around. We played soccer together. We played hockey together, but our families never, ever mixed. There was clearly a divide. And I had noticed, but not really thought much about it. And so suddenly I was confronted how none of these kids. So I started asking questions, and we then moved very quickly. And I ended up learning a little bit about the prison camps, the residential schools. So I started asking the question, how was this rather massive ignorance produced in me? And then realizing I'm not the accidental product of misinformation. I'm the product of a successful colonial education. And it's interesting to look back and to look at exactly how that is produced through the precise means it's produced. And the mental health field at that time certainly did not provide any way kind of out of that. I mean, one of the important things that Imelda and Nolig really showed, I think, was their conversations about colonialism were actually very, very helpful as well to me, although they were coming at it from another kind of an angle, but very much connected. And to hear them talking about these things and looking at resistance in the margins and commentary, that really was very affirming, but also, took me other places to think about this pattern being more widespread. The other thing I would say is that I'm a working class kid. I don't have a lot of truck with assholes and puffed up people who are smug and self-important, and you find more than your fair share of those in the mental health field and at universities. And you find a certain level of classism written into a lot of academic theories, where things are written about in a way that is inaccessible to 99% of the people on the planet, yet those are the very people it's concerned with. And there's something fundamentally wrong with that. Writing in ways about human existence, particularly about how people respond to violence and real adversities in their lives, in a way that most of those people, because they don't have graduate degrees, could never really take apart. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. And so ethical problems with that, but also, and of course, the DSM and psychiatry and psychology very much constructed along those lines. So, and also meeting Linda Coates, who's another working class kid, I think we shared a certain sensibility around that helped fuel our critique, I would say. Yeah. The other thing was, though, that I'm I've been very fortunate to have wonderful, wonderful parents. I've been comparatively highly privileged in a lot of different ways in my life. In other words, my partner Kathy is awesome, and we had one kid when I started my PhD. When we had 5 when I finished, and so
I remember that somewhere that you've written that, and just
without all of that kind of support and connection and love and from other people. So I was in a very fortunate position to be able to pursue these questions. I think lots and lots of people have had very clear ideas along these lines and have not necessarily been in a position in their lives that would have allowed them to pursue them. A good example of that would be say somebody like Frantz Fanon. But of course, there are many others who, people of color, who were experiencing profound racism and classism, who just did not have the opportunity to languish in the support of others and go to university and hang out in libraries, and
Yeah.
So yeah.
Can I take us to practice?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I've got a few different questions about practice. I'm trying to decide where to start. I think I'll start not in the same place that I did with Vicky and Shelley, which was one of the things I've noticed reading a lot of different people's things about response-based practice or honoring resistance in practice is a lot of the people writing are family therapists.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the examples given are of practice with an individual.
Mm-hmm.
Case studies, or when you're sort of going through this is the conversation that I had. And I wondered if that's because it's easier with individuals, or if it, what's creating that sort of series of examples. I will say Kathy's work has more family examples, but most of the examples that I read, one person, and then most of my practice is with families.
Yeah. Yeah. I think as long as, if you're thinking systemically, contextually, interactionally, if you're thinking about the possibility of violence or power or influence, if you're thinking about poverty and class and gender, and if you're thinking about those things when you're interviewing any person, I think that's the key thing, that you're contextualizing. Who's in the room matters a great deal. And often for me, it's a progression. So I might meet with an individual, let's say a woman who wants to talk about, say, having anxiety disorder. And then we have a conversation and we end up talking about, how the whole notion that she had anxiety seemed to coincide with certain horrible experiences in her life. And then I learned that she and her partner have been having struggles, and would she like her partner to be part of the conversation? And yes, and when would that be safe enough? And when would be the right moment to do that? And then her partner joins, and then I end up meeting with the kids. And so sometimes, you kind of take your lead from the aspirations of the person and what's practical. And when there are cases of violence, which is the vast majority of my work, as you know, there are other considerations. There are a number of considerations about when and if you bring other people into the room. So sometimes I've met with families individually and not together. I think both ways are good. Both ways are useful. I don't have a sort of a preference for one or the other. It's more, if you're thinking contextually and interactionally, I think for me, that's the main thing.
And how would you do this kind of conversation with a family rather than with just one person?
You might ask Dad if he's able to tell when the kids get concerned for how their mom's feeling, and what do they notice? And when he notices that they're concerned about their mom, what does he do? And when she notices, who does she talk to first? Or what? So you might ask those kinds of triadic or interactional or relational questions. So that presupposes that the father might have some ideas about that, whereas it might be completely new information for him. Or I might ask a 14-year-old, do you think your mom has anxiety disorder, or do you think she's afraid of your father when he drinks? So sometimes the questions can be quite direct and blunt. And when you have a sense that things are going to go south with your folks, how do you respond? What do you do? And I might have that conversation in front of them. Some of my colleagues working in women's shelters, I'm thinking particularly of Kayushi's place in Yukon, Renee Claude Carrier, Barb McInerney, their whole team, they make a point of trying to have conversations with kids and mothers together, because domestic and family violence, as you know, is an attack on the parent-child bond. And so they have those conversations deliberately to help moms see how their kids have been responding and resisting, and to help kids see the same kind of things with their moms, because so often that's new information
Yeah.
to the two of them. And so that can help restore something
Mm.
that's kind of under attack by an abusive dad, let's say. So
That would be done without abusive dad present.
yep, that would be done without abusive dad. So, I mean, you're always making decisions around safety, eh? What's the safest, most useful way to
Yeah.
go about this? Yeah.
For some of the moments that I've maybe struggled in practice is not where there's serious violence and then you're in that, okay, safety, let's make sure that we're talking to these people separately, or those kinds of bits
Mm-hmm.
of, but in, you're with some parents and their child, and you have a parent who's sort of putting their child down and humiliating them in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I might see the child responding in ways that the parents are interpreting as they've got an anger problem or something of that.
Yes.
And I'm seeing their responses as resistance. I'm seeing in the moment, that actually
Mm-hmm.
parents saying, like, the way you behave is disgusting, or, whatever it is, or,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why you would be so stupid to think that
Right.
is a good way to be. The things that parents do say to children and don't realize the
Yeah.
impact. I can see the child reacting, and I can see how their reaction is being interpreted one way, and I would love to see it understood in context.
Yeah.
But how to do that in a way that isn't then shaming the parents, or enables them to recontextualize their child's behavior.
Yeah.
Is there a way, is there a way to bring resistance into that conversation that's helpful?
Yeah. I mean, it depends so much on the background of that conversation, doesn't it? What they're coming from. Um, but one of the projects that a colleague did in Ballarat, South Australia, Kristen Sheridan, she and a colleague interviewed. They had a women's resistance group, and Women for Dignity and Justice, I think it was, but they called it. Anyway, they ended up celebrating women's resistance in that group. And they then evaluated what the women had to say. And the women said there were three major things. One, they realized that they had been resisting the violence all the way along, and they'd never noticed that before or realized that, and they felt better and stronger than they had before. Number two, they realized that what their partners had done to them was deliberate. They were doing the things deliberately to hurt them, the things that hurt the most. And that was very painful and very helpful. And third, that they also saw that their children had been responding and resisting the violence and unhappy with everything that was going on because of that backdrop of violence. And that helped them see their kids differently. And so I think part of it is how we bring that information forward. In a context like that, not knowing what they're responding to in the background, I wouldn't assume that the mother doesn't know that it hurts the child, that they wouldn't realize that. I might take that into account. I might actually think maybe they are intending to hurt the child, that they are intending to upset them, and that they know very well that it upsets their child. And I might even ask them about that. So that's upsetting to Bobby when you talk to Bobby that way. You know, and you could tell from how he's responding. Can you tell me a little bit, knowing how hurtful that is to Bobby? How is it that you make the decision to do that? Right. So I might just be pretty confrontational about it, or just pretty direct about it in that kind of a context. If the context is one of, I might also ask Bobby, like, I notice your mom talks to you this way sometimes in front of her. She says this to you, she says that to you. Looks to me like you're pretty unhappy about that when that happens. But do other people talk to you that way? Who are they? What happens then?
Mm.
What does your mom do when your dad talks to you that way? So there are all kinds of possibilities there. There is often a backdrop if it's a domestic and family violence case where some women get begin to parent their kids in a very critical manner in order to try to control them so that they don't upset the offending parent. Or sometimes parents are so absolutely grief-stricken that they are now tied to this offender by this child for the rest of their lives. That becomes a very stark, difficult realization to deal with. Um, so I think a great deal of what's called postpartum depression can be understood that way. So, so it's contextual, but those are some of the questions I'd have in my head.
Mm. No, that's really helpful. I feel like it's a little push to me to be braver, maybe. If I'm noticing something, worrying a bit less about how naming that will be received.
Yeah, and in fact, it may be received. You may be the only person ever to confront that parent in front of the child.
Yeah.
And they could be thinking, holy shit, that's scary, but wow, you rock. And for them to have a person who they feel is standing up for them in that moment, as we know from the literature of social responses, right, that those kinds of things, what might seem like a small thing to you, can actually be absolutely immense in the long term for kids. Yeah.
How do you talk about power and resistance with families that you work with?
There's always a process of getting to know people and who they are culturally,
Yeah.
in terms of their relationship historically, what they do for a living, do they have money, gender, sexuality. There's so many different dimensions to getting to know people, and then I want to know how they got the wacky idea to come to talk to a complete stranger about their lives. Often I want to know if they've done that in the past. Have they gone to talk with people before about their lives? Oh, you've frozen now, Alma. I'm not sure if that matters.
I can still hear you, and it seems fine for me. Now you've frozen for me. I think it's your internet. Let's see. We'll come back. You're back.
Oh, we're back. We're back. Good. Well done.
Uh,
So I can't remember exactly where I left off, but
got a sort of broader getting to know them that you
yeah.
do.
Yeah, and then you get a sense of how is it that you got the wacky idea to come and talk to a complete stranger about your life, and have you done this kind of thing before? And how did that go? What prompted you? How did you make the decision to do this at this time? And so I want to begin to always to be contextualize those decisions and their concerns, what's happening in their life now. But also the question about have you talked with other people before? I often start asking about the quality of social responses to family members before we get into any detailed conversation about their lives. I think that it's for many families, or individuals, it's extremely important. They've had a series of very negative responses from institutional actors over a long period of time, and that's important information for me to have. And it helps to put into context the decision to come forward and how they might be feeling about the whole business of coming forward and what they might be afraid of and what difference it's made for them to have reached out to talk to other people in the past and have it go nowhere or have their lives get worse. As you know, if you've been working with kids and families and child protection in particular, you know that many, many people will have reported a whole litany of very negative experiences. And so if they've had positive experiences, you can ask, how was that helpful? And build on that. And if they've had negative experiences, you can ask, how did you respond to that? What did you do? Oh, I just stopped going. Oh, you fired the therapist. Look at you go. So apparently you have your own ideas about how this kind of conversation should go. I'm glad to hear that. Because what that tells me is that if I get off track, that you'll let me know. And so you can begin to build a relationship that way. And by identifying, I don't know, let's say certain forms of competency or understanding or awareness in the way that they've managed previous social responses. And then I'll ask about how and when particular concerns began to be concerns. And often, so anxiety, can you tell me a little bit more about that? And when did you begin to feel this way? And who did you first talk to? So once you begin to put things into context, and then you're doing a genogram and you're learning about who's in the family, and one guy said to me, I'm asking, what about your folks? Do you have folks? He says, I don't have parents. I have people that raised me. Okay. Um, would it be okay if I ask you a little bit about that? And then very quickly, so often just in the process of getting to know who's in the social ecology of somebody, you know what I mean? They'll start mentioning key events. And then you begin the process of trying to connect those key events, possibly with diagnoses or with certain expressions of suffering, and with the decision to come forward. And you can begin to tie things together in that way, if that answers your question.
It starts to, but at what so when you spoke about that women's group, for example, that they had these three big realizations.
Yeah.
We're at the point of using language like resistance and potentially, or of naming those things.
Okay. Yeah.
And most people don't come into therapy talking like that about their experiences.
Oh yeah. No, I don't. I often avoid that language entirely.
Mm-hmm.
I never ask people how they resisted, because the language is just too complex and weird. So I'll focus initially with people on things like, okay, well, so when that happened, I mean, when your dad was beating up your brother, and you were little, like, how did you respond to that even at the time? Do you remember? Okay, so you kind of avoided being at home. Huh. How did you do that? In what other ways did you do that? And then you can begin to get more and more detailed accounts of how a person responded. And then you can come back at some point and say, wow, so obviously you were not okay with that. You were not okay with your dad being so aggressive and violent to your brother. Did your brother know that? Did your brother know that you were not okay with that? How did he know? So you can make decisions about tracking interactions that are connected. You're seeing his responses as being situated, valid, understanding, showing awareness and concern. And then you can come back at some point later and say, so we've been talking about this for a while now, and I can see that you were doing everything you could either to protect your brother or to get the hell out of there. Even to the point of confronting your father at different points of time. How is it that you just have persisted in protecting your brother for so long? So that's a language that presupposes competency. It's contextual. It's situational. It's but I'm not using the word resistance. With other people, it can be very important to use the resistance. It's like, holy shit, you're no shrinking violet. Obviously, you were not going to let him get away with this. How is it that you were able to resist this violence in such a direct manner, right from the get-go? And with some people, because they get interested sort of in where the conversation's going and how, wow, this is so different. You can have conversations about how you're trying to work with them and about the language, and begin to sort of take apart you quote unquote your methodology to try to be transparent about what you're trying to do. And well, I think this way and that way, and with other people, of course, you wouldn't do that because they're not so interested, or their age or what have you. So I think I try to, to me, it's a kitchen table conversation, ordinary language, jargon free, mental health, jargon free, and so that virtually anyone who's part of the conversation should be able to understand everything that's said. And the language of resistance or what have you can get a bit abstract,
Yeah.
unless you've built up a fact base to
Yeah.
talk about. Yeah.
Connected to. What about power? Is that something that you'll talk about, or sort of structural power or structural oppression? Again, not in those words, but
yeah, exactly. Not in those words, but
ideas.
So when your boss hit on you at work, did you tell anyone? Yeah, I told my friend, she also works there. What did she have to say? She said, oh yeah, God, he's a creep. He did that to me as well. Did you talk with the boss? Oh God, no. I said, yeah, you need the job, right? Yeah, I need the job. I can't talk with my boss. So we'll talk, that's power. So we'll talk about the consequences and link up the responses to the possible consequences of the responses. And another way of doing that is by talking about institutional and social network responses to the person, because those often come from a position of power over as well. So that the theme of power or undue influence or someone being physically stronger or politically more powerful or socially more powerful, that comes up all the time.
How does it come?
Well, if you ask about how people respond to certain things and you begin to think about why this way and why not that way, it becomes pretty clear that people are aware of the dangers they face. And I know that if I go talk with cops, I'm an Indigenous woman. I know if I go talk with the cops, they're not going to believe me. They're going to make me take a polygraph, even though this guy raped me. And they're going to call the child protection people and they're going to come and take my kids.
Yeah.
So they're talking about power all the time. And so I'm interested in how people orient to power, the power that they perceive in their lives, the violence they perceive in their lives. It's a bit analogous to the position taken around context in conversation analysis, if that's not too abstract a shift. But what they do in conversation analysis, which I think is very interesting, we always talk about context as being really important, but how do we know what parts of a context are relevant for particular people at a particular time? We don't necessarily know that. So I could have all kinds of theories about power and it being in the room, et cetera, and that may or may not be the case for the people I'm meeting with. So sort of, I'm interested in how the people I'm working for orient to power, influence, violence, what they perceive as happening. And then, of course, I have my own favorite ideas about the diagnostic system itself that gets used, the ICD, the DSM, et cetera, child protection frameworks like islands of safety or whatever they might be, or signs of safety or others that do not have an adequate analysis of interpersonal violence whatsoever. And so the misuse of these colonial frameworks to further pigeonhole and debase people. So I have that, and I try to be careful with that, to not to sort of use my own pet analysis of that to sort of impose my views of that structural violence on everyone that I'm meeting with. I can offer up the notion that, well, you're certainly clinically oppressed and you've been taking anti-oppressant medication for a long period of time, but depressed, I'm not quite sure how that makes sense in the context. So, you can offer up critiques or analysis or different ways of understanding things, but that too, you have to be careful with, because that may have little or nothing to do with why they're there talking with you.
Have you had times where you've been trying to have a conversation like that and it's just not landed or it's not worked?
Yeah, if I go too fast,
Mm-hmm.
if I fall in love too quickly with my own favorite ideas, if I'm rushed for some other reason, and distracted.
Tell me about too fast, because that one for me definitely resonates as something that
Yeah.
I do sometimes.
Yeah. I think I can get, I don't know what, being enthusiastic might be the reason some of the time. Sometimes it could be fatigue. Sometimes I get an idea fairly early on with someone, and then it takes them a few minutes of saying basically in different language, different ways, no, that's not, before I notice.
Mm.
Um, so if I remember to remind myself to go slow, and if I'm feeling angry, for example, at somebody, one member of a couple, if I'm feeling, you're a bit of a dick, aren't you? The way you're talking to your partner here, then what I try to do, I try to remember Bosco and Chiquine at those moments. And their conversations we had about, your reactions, or your whatever you want to say, countertransference is it's important information for you. You have to treat it as information,
Mm.
not just necessarily disregard it and go, oh, come on, Alan, smart now. That there's a place for that. But if I'm getting angry at somebody, it may not be a bad idea for me to think, look at me, I really don't like this person. How the hell did I convince them, myself, that they're not likable? How the hell did I do that? I wonder if there are other people in their lives who do the same thing. So maybe I'm going to wonder a little bit about that and ask about it as we go along. So if I treat it like information, I'm better off normally. But yeah, go slow, then get slower, then slow down.
And take a break.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm. How do you avoid misusing your own clinical power?
I think I have a view that we have access to certain forms of power, social power, status, on all kinds of dimensions. And we don't know how other people are oriented to us in that regard, necessarily. I think one thing that's important to me in my own practice is I try to have a sense of humor. That is to say, an ongoing view of my own sort of ridiculousness, so to speak, an awareness of the classism of the whole experience, and the way in which language is set up to, like the term clinical, right? Term I never use. So there's all kinds of nefarious bits of language and structures that are set up to position us in relation to others like that. So I just try to be aware of it, I suppose.
Tell me a bit more about avoiding clinical. I've read lots
Well,
about that you're talking about avoiding trauma, or sort of the ways
yeah.
the trauma discourse is problematic.
Well, clinical means medical, and it means illness. And so it's sort of like a trapdoor into the language of biomedicine. And it's a status claim. All you have to do is watch CNN or something like that for part of an evening, and you'll find, 50 commercials on pharmaceuticals, and they all mention the clinical trials, clinically proven, clinically this, clinically that. It's a kind of a status marketing capitalist pharmaceutical, and it's a status term. For example, here in my area, the provincial government started to rename people who were doing counseling or social work, and they decided to call them child and youth clinicians, right? I mean, I have no idea why that decision was made, but why not let's use a language that could be even more intimidating and distancing, and is going to make some sort of bizarre status claim about people. Nothing had changed in their training. So it's just, without getting my knickers too much in a knot, I try to be really careful with that kind of language, because there's lots of ways in which biomedical frameworks are simply brought into the room and into the conversation when they need not be.
How do you describe what you do?
Sometimes I say I'm a family therapist, so I use the word therapy,
Mm-hmm.
or that I'm a counselor, or that kind of a thing generally. Normally, I describe myself as a family therapist, unless I'm talking to, unless I'm doing a training with a bunch of judges, and then I'll refer to myself as a PhD in psychology and a researcher. So, it just varies on which sort of vocabulary or identity term is going to be the most suited.
And how do you explain what a family therapist does to a family?
I tell people when I say I'm a family therapist, it doesn't mean I meet with families, because I mostly don't. And this is what I actually say. It just means that I think the relationships that people have in their lives are really, really important. So I'm interested in relationships. That's why I use the term family therapy.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I explain.
And I'm presuming you do, but how, do you feel helpful, and how do you know that what you're doing is valuable or helpful?
Well, I ask questions about that. People tell me. I get information back from the people who referred them. Sometimes. I live in a small town. I meet them on the street. I see people all the time that I've worked for, and we have some sort of fun eye contact in the vegetable section of the grocery store, and we don't talk. Or, I'm having a drink someplace, and then I go to pay the bill, and it's been paid by this other person in the room who was someone I worked for. But mostly I ask people, and I follow up and try to track if they're reporting changes. I try to track that in pretty detailed ways. So yeah, like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm noticing that you talk about working for people.
Yeah, I
Even
reckon.
that,
Yeah.
it's a different language. Like I hear a lot of I work with people.
Yeah, and I say I'm an employee. That's how I see it. And I reckon I work for people in that they hire me for a particular job. I'm not hired by, even if I'm paid by a third party, I'm not hired by them. I'm hired by the family. I'm hired for the people, and they're clearly my client, not the. So I stopped doing work for employee and family assistance programs some years ago, because they wanted all kinds of extraneous information and diagnoses and this and that. Clearly, they had not thought through who was supposed to be the employer in the situation. And so I'm fortunate. Again, that's one of the ways in which I'm privileged. I'm fortunate to just be able to say, yeah, no, I don't want to work with you anymore. And so I've been able to kind of follow my own nose in that regard, just because of the training, because of the PhD, because of that kind of thing. I've been able to, because I have had a busy private practice, I haven't had to rely on that kind of thing. The younger people in different positions coming into the field are not so fortunate. So they have to make peace, or they have to find a way to work with third-party organizations where the clients, the employers, are being talked about in really problematic ways, and the institutions are very beholden to sort of standard biomedical colonial approaches. They have to find a way to work through that, and I respect them for doing that, and I don't have to. So that's a luxury. I think the value of it is that it leaves more options open for the people I work for. So, if I can take the position that, yeah, I see that you need to have a diagnosis of clinical depression and PTSD in order that you'll continue to get the benefits so that you can be away from work for 6 months. So yeah, I'm happy to write a letter to the effect that you have clinical depression and PTSD. And you and I have an understanding that that is not a valid way of talking about you, but I know that you need the letter. So, that's what I mean by being clear about who I work for.
Yeah. Vicky said something very similar.
Yeah. Yeah.
The systems are there, those sort of structures. It doesn't help people to.
No, and exactly. And if you, depending on how you want to look at it, but I mean, even if you look on these sort of clinical biomedical systems or the standard psychological mechanisms, psychological testing, so on and so forth. If you just look at these things on a sort of scientific level, do they have validity? And of course, the diagnostic categories in the DSM are not scientifically valid categories. But we have governments and organizations that refer to them as evidence-based all the time. And there are young people diagnosing themselves left, right, and center via Google or the internet all the time. And try talking them out of it. It's pretty scary.
Yeah. I'm about to move my work context from being social care, and I'm going into a more medically determined system.
Yeah.
And I don't know what these diagnoses mean because it's never actually been a part of my training.
Yeah.
But I'm going to have a fast track in.
Yeah, you will. Yeah. And they,
because the population I'll be working for teenagers who've been assessed as needing to go to hospital, but instead of going to hospital, the team I'm working with is trying to work at home so they don't have to go to hospital.
Okay.
Which aligns with my ethics in terms of trying to support people not to end up in hospital unless it's absolutely necessary. But I will be the only family therapist, and it will be a very different sort of a very different context. And I've been trying to think about like what of these ideas, which I've been spending so much time thinking about in a social care context, how am I going to use them there?
Yeah, well, as you know, the single best predictor of whether or not a person is going to wind up in a service like that is whether or not they've experienced violence. So you're going to be dealing with a lot of those cases where that is part of the picture for people. And so this kind of a framework can be pulled in and and also there's increasing evidence of the sort of usefulness of this framework that has been gathered from different parts of the world. So there is some basis for talking about this as being a widely evidence-based and widely applied. But then, you've got to get along with your clinical supervisors and and that you are working as a family therapist in a system like that might mean that you can do even more good, because you're going to probably provide another kind of perspective for people, much more contextual. And they might not get that otherwise.
Yeah. I hope so. I'll try.
Yeah. And also family therapy, as you know, has been rapidly in decline for the past, I don't know how many years. And so with the rise of CBT and other highly individualist models here in North America, at least, family therapy has really been pushed back. And there's even youth services where people are not allowed to meet with the parents and the kids. They can only meet the kids. And so there's been a really hyper sort of production of the individual pathology frameworks and those practices related to that notion. And so I think there's a really dire need for family therapy kinds of approaches to be coming back into the picture.
Yeah. I'm noticing that when you talk, it's almost always about violence. That's your primary focus. And I've been thinking about violence, but I've also been thinking about oppression.
Sure.
Which could be called racialized violence or violence. But I'm wondering for you, is there a focus? Is the focus because your way in is in those sort of the interactions between people, and so you're going to call that the violence, and you might have some theoretical connections to wider systems of oppression, but your focus is on the micro, or am I missing?
Oh no, our focus is on the micro and the macro and everything in between. And that's the importance of talking about social network and institutional responses to people, with people, because that's where the micro meets the macro. I mean, it's the rape myths from the larger culture that are held by the police officer that figure into how the police officer interviews the child, so to speak. And so you get these micro structures, practices, ideas, very much coming to bear on the life of individual families through the arena of social network and institutional responses. And so, for example, I've done a lot of work with Indigenous people for the last, I don't know, 30 years. And the levels of structural violence and oppression that they face are just beyond. I mean, it would be very difficult to do justice to what Indigenous people here in this part of the world have had to deal with, and are continuing to deal with. The levels of racism, state-sanctioned racism, violence of extractive industries, the abuse of Indigenous and killing of Indigenous women around the globe, connected with man camps, mining companies that are supported by the Canadian government, Canadian ambassadors trumpeting the value of mining companies in places where we know mining companies have been responsible for the destruction of communities, the hiring of violent militias, and the destruction of the environment. So, it's on every structural level, and we have a federal government that has been informed of these problems and continues to ignore them, and continues to support the interests of mining companies. So then we begin to take into account, let's say, porn violence, and the fact that the average age at which boys in North America view porn images is 11. And we're seeing a lot of that in our practice. And so we're seeing the production of porn violence and the channeling of those images into the lives of kids on a massive scale. The UK has been slightly ahead of us in that regard, in terms of putting in place better age verification and safeguards for kids, but it's still nowhere near where it needs to be. So all of these forms of structural level forms of oppression meet the lives of individuals, and we try to work with individuals in such a way as we learn about those experiences and their orientation to them. And sometimes we have to bring the topic in, about, oh, okay, you worked in a mining camp. How was that? Oh, well, I ended up quitting. Okay. And then I know to ask, because I know that there's extremely high levels of violence against women who work in man camps. And that mining companies do nothing about it. And that federal governments and provincial governments and territorial governments know that the companies do nothing about it. So, we have ongoing racist violence against Indigenous people at a rather, at an absolutely astronomical level in my part of the world and in other parts of the world. So we're working with courts. I have a conversation with a couple of justices on the Supreme Court of Canada coming up very soon about much better language that they've been using in a recent legal judgment. That is now a Supreme Court decision, which is much better. So we've been working in child protection, psychology, social work, women's shelters, transition houses, programs for men who've been abusive and other people who've been abusive. So what we're trying to do is influence every public institution that becomes involved when oppression and violence is at issue. That's the project. Doing therapy is part of it, but it's a small part of it.
Do these feel like the right kinds of questions? Are there other things you think?
No, absolutely. I think what's interesting to you is what's important, and I think the questions are interesting and to the point. They're good questions to me. So
yeah. I'm asking everyone that because I'm also stealing questions for my next interviews when
sure.
if people have other ideas.
Sure.
Let's just think about social care for a moment, or children's services, or state services.
Child protection services. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
That's primarily been my context.
Sure.
Nearly a decade. And I'm a social worker by background, so that's my youth work, social work, family therapy. My
right.
route into this. Have you found any sort of adjustments that you've needed to make when you are working with families with child protective services? I think as you called it, different names here,
Yeah,
children, just be children's
sure.
services, involved in their lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know because I've looked carefully and I work with child protection people internationally quite closely. And also, we have colleagues like in New South Wales, Kate Alexander, who's the senior practitioner of child protection there, have been bringing response-based practice into child protection practice. And also in talking with child protection workers, I know, I mean, Shelley and I had an experience, I'm not sure if she told you about this, but we were in New South Wales 3-4 years ago now, and we did a training there, and there were 1,100 frontline child protection workers.
Wow.
Yeah, and Andrew Turnell was there, and I've been saying to Andrew for years, Andrew, there was no analysis of violence and signs of safety. And, when 85, 80, 85, 90, 95% of your cases involve violence, you need to have a framework that is specifically attuned to understanding violence, how people respond, how people exercise violence, how to interview people who've used violence. So I asked the people in the room just at the end of a tea break, how many of you would, show of hands, how many of you would say that roughly 80%, 85% of your cases involve some form of violence, often multiple? Every hand in the room went up. How many of you received training on how to interview people who perpetrate violence before you became a frontline child protection worker? Not a hand went up. So, of course, there's problems because the people who design these programs don't have an analysis of violence, and they're not adequately preparing the people that come into the field to do the job that needs to be done. So I am not critical of individual workers. I'm highly critical of public institutions called universities that provide no training for lawyers, no training for medical doctors, no training for child protection workers, no training for psychologists around interpersonal violence. So that is a structural problem. And of course, we have wealthy, well-placed people making the decision to not train lawyers, for example. And so of course you have problems. Of course you have problems. You have often young people come out really trying hard to do very important work. And what they need is support. And if they have a great team leader, they're really lucky. And they can get the benefit of that team leader's experience. And if they don't, it can be really tragic. So I'm always interested in working with the worker if I can, trying to learn about where the worker comes from, what they're seeing, what makes them think the family is a good candidate for working with me or somebody, what's been helpful. And then, and there are certain specific aspects of cases that they're not encouraged to address at all because it's not in the structured decision-making framework or it's not in the signs of safety framework. So for instance, they're not encouraged to learn how people respond to and resist violence. So what they'll reproduce is the stereotypical image of the non-protective parent, right? Because they don't have adequate training. And then, of course, that's a problem. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I don't know if it's the same where you are, but judges here that sit in the family courts can come from any part of the law.
Yeah.
So you'll have a judge who's had their whole career in corporate litigation.
Yeah.
Suddenly asking questions and being involved in a case with family violence, and asking totally inappropriate questions, or being, they've got such an important role.
Absolutely. Yeah, the family law arena is absolutely tragic. Don't know if you've seen Jess Hill's book about that, where she has a good section on family law. The book is called See What You Made Me Do. And she's got and the problems are international. I was in Sweden and Denmark this last week and last couple of weeks, and a whole bunch of people mentioned family law and are we involved in family law? And we're quite involved in family law arena. And in doing critical analysis of expert reports, in producing reports in cases where there's violence ourselves, in training judges, and in training lawyers. So because it's such an important arena of work. I mean, now we have women's organizations here, for example, who advise women who have separated from men who've been violent to not report the violence to the court, because if they do, um, there will be an expert assigned. They'll do psychological tests and they'll find out that the woman has a borderline personality disorder and is a non-protective parent. So they tell them, if you do that, there's a good chance you're going to lose your kids. That's how the system operates. It's absolutely tragic. Yeah. So we have a lot of work to do there on all these structural levels. And what we're trying to do is work with allies and colleagues in different professional groups to bring better analytic framework and better practices into each of these arenas, basically all of the arenas that involve addressing interpersonal violence.
And
Broadly defined to include oppression.
Yes.
Yeah.
What do your detractors say?
I don't know. That I'm sanctimonious, or we don't get, I think I can speak for all of us about this. We don't get a lot of pushback around the content of the ideas. I think the framework we've developed is by no means perfect and is by no means applicable everywhere. But it's pretty solid on its main points, and it's linked up to lots of really solid practice, family therapy, solution-focused, narrative, post-colonial, feminist-informed, and academic traditions that are very solid. So we don't get a lot of pushback on that level. Where we might get a bit of pushback is more on the level of status. Who are you to say this? Something like that, where okay, tell me what's wrong with what we're saying. And so I think also some of the things we have to say are quite critical of status quo. And there do need to be significant changes, and we're speaking about those things. And there are people in positions of authority who don't want to hear that. Because if you're told that your child protection system that you've paid a lot of money for actually doesn't contain an adequate analysis of interpersonal violence, you might just not want to know that, unfortunately. But a lot of people do.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine it even in my own, one borough in London, in one city, that signs of safety is what's used in every single one of our child protection processes.
Yeah, sure. So I've had these conversations with Andrew over many years, and one of the things we've done is just modified some of their tools. So for example, 3 houses that gets used as a tool. We just added a shed, 3 houses and a response-based shed. So when you're in the house of worries and you're asking about what worries you have, and dad yells at mom, we ask in the house of responses, how do you respond to that? What do you do? And then we learn that kids are responding to and resisting violence and trying to protect mom and trying to protect dad. So, we're just trying to work with the tools that they've created in order to make them more contextual.
I love that. Tell me more. What other tools have you adapted?
Well, just the interviewing. I wouldn't say other tools. I would say just the approach to interviewing. I think it is very helpful to talk with people about safety and what needs to happen for there to be safety. How will they know that they're safe enough? And to get down to nuts and bolts and detailed language. But I think if you're not bringing in accounts of how people actually already respond to and resist violence, you can be missing a great deal. So we bring that part of interviewing into all of our conversations. And that's important because when we do safety planning with somebody, we're doing safety planning on top of what they already know and do. And that's an important part because you're then acknowledging what a person already does, already knows, so on and so forth. And that's an important beginning with anybody, I believe. So we can have those conversations about safety, signs of safety, but we can add things that make the conversations more applicable to cases of violence. Yeah, and 3 houses on a shed has been a wonderful tool. Shelley and her team make really good use of that tool. They have wonderful examples to share.
Yeah. No, I run a reflective practice group for our newly qualified social workers.
Okay.
And I could imagine them all being like, oh yeah, that's, there's things that are deeper changes,
Mhm.
and then the ways in can sometimes be the way into a deeper conceptual change, but how that practical way in can make a big difference. Like, oh, I see how that changes what I do, changes how I think. Because like with that group, we were just talking about a case of family violence, interpersonal violence. The dad had been very violent towards the mum. I wasn't a dad, a partner.
Okay. Yeah.
And the social worker was saying, the mum didn't tell me that she had a partner. And what she was bringing to the group was like, did I do something wrong? Like, is this on me that this violence happened because I didn't do a good enough job in making her feel safe to talk to me? She didn't feel able to tell me that this man was a part of, never mind that he was a violent, scary part of her life. And the whole conversation changed when we talked more about where she might have learned that we're not safe. And sort of how, the ways in which she might have been being protective by not being honest with us.
Yeah, lovely. And so, as soon as you bring in institutional responses, the history of institutional responses to people, well, often things just immediately make sense in another way. Yeah, for sure.
And would you call that resistance for sort of not being honest, or would you just talk about that as learning from institutional responses? I know it doesn't really matter in terms of what you do. I'm just thinking, theoretically, how do I pass these bits?
I mean, if you've learned that if you tell the truth to somebody in that position of authority, that they're going to remove your kids, that's a form of violence in that context. Then sure, that can be understood as a form of resistance. And it can also be understood as protection of your children, which could be understood as a form of resistance. So I try not to get hung up on that language too much, because a number of years ago, I wrote a short paragraph called "The Scope of Resistance." Because of course, it is so diverse, so endlessly particular and diverse, which is what's beautiful, that there could never be a definition. There could never be a way of saying this is and that isn't. Because human experience is simply too complex. Situations are too complex. So we've stayed away from trying to have a definition, and just tried to appreciate how particular kinds of responses may be understandable in that kind of a way. And then the question of what language you bring is, again, always very particular to the folks you're with and why they're with you. And something that I think I've started to focus on more in the last, say, 5 or 10 years. You know how we have this language of resiliency and that kind of a thing? It's a language of strength and strength-based approaches and so forth. And we've really steered clear of that. And one of the reasons is that many of the people that I've met with over the years, and this would be true for Shelley and Kathy as well, is that they're not interested in us telling them that they're resilient or that they're particularly strong. And when you read memoir, autobiography of people who faced really extreme violence, good example would be Taras Shevchenko, the Ukrainian, beloved Ukrainian muse, poet, sculptor. He wrote an essay called My Life, which is just a profoundly beautiful essay about his life as a boy escaping a whole series of really violent, what would you call them, farmers who wanted him to be a laborer, and ultimately getting away because it turns out he was supremely talented artistically. And he writes this essay, and he talks a lot about what he had to do in the whole situation. And at the very last paragraph, he writes, about, and what have I gained from my bare life in telling this story? And he said, it's been difficult because what is even more difficult for me is to admit that my fellow serfs are not so fortunate. And so he would resist any notion that he was especially resilient or especially strong. And we see that again and again and again. because people don't want to feel elevated and separate from. Okay, they want to feel in solidarity with and connected to. And so I think that's this sort of theme of humility in resistance that I think is very important. And so I hope that that's reflected in our interviewing. We're very careful not to try to stand people up and go, wow, you're amazing. You're so resilient. You're so strong. Because for many people, that's a separation of them from others who they feel very connected with. And it's kind of it's a cheerleading. And I think much more important is a quiet acknowledgement of both the suffering and the resistance. And I think by and large, that's far more useful. So we don't traffic in the language of strengths-based or resilience notion, particularly.
So tell me where a question like, how have you managed that? Right? Like,
yeah.
Is that cheerleading? Is that not?
Well, it depends a lot on how you ask it. But if you were to say, so, okay, he's got the shower cord around your neck. And you can still breathe a little bit because you've got your hands in there. And then you're thinking, I know he doesn't want to hurt me. Do you mind him? How is it that you have a thought like that at a moment like that? It's just a legitimate question. And without pumping it up to be something sort of, how is it that you have a thought like that at a moment like that? Because I'm pretty sure I'd be thinking, tell my family I love them, Oh, I don't know. I guess because my dad was a drunk and my mom was a nurse. Well, okay. Sorry, you lost me. Could you connect those dots for me? Like, how are those things connect? Oh, well, my mom told me, if my dad ever wants me to make him a rum and Coke, because by the middle of the afternoon, he's drunk every day. She said, if I'm not home and he wants you to make a rum and Coke, just fill the glass with Coke and take a tiny little bit of rum and rub it on your fingers and then rub the rim of the glass. So what you're telling me is that you've been forced to kind of retain your composure and think about things in horrible situations. This has been forced upon you by events in your life. So you've learned how to do that. So then I think it's relatively accurate and contextual and simple and direct without cheerleading. But if you're orienting to it as a competency, as an appropriate response, I think that's the key. And then to what extent you should focus on it or see it as a particular strength or ability, that's a kind of a judgment that you make with every person you're meeting with. I mean, it might be the case that a 11-year-old kid might really love you to notice how strong they are. But a 45-year-old woman who's been multiply raped and doesn't talk to the police and feels really horrible about everything, you know what I mean? That language may be completely inappropriate. So, yeah, we just try to be very mindful of not cheerleading, as it were.
Yeah, you can probably hear I'm interested in this because I'm thinking about my own practice when you're saying that and trying to think, cheerleading, was that helpful? How did that land? I'm thinking about a moment when a woman we were talking about the social responses of her family from a previous relationship that was violent. And, and she was a bit embarrassed, I think, that most of her family don't really know how bad it was, that she had, she's too ashamed or, not able to tell them. And I'd asked about how did the first people that she told respond? Like, where did she learn not to? And the more she spoke about it, the more it was obvious that like that was a really sensible decision. And she does want to talk to them now. But, now that she's like a few years away from this and feels ready to challenge if they come out with problematic things.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think if I veered into cheerleading, right? Like, because I did do a bit of what I'm hearing is that you made some choices there about keeping yourself safe and not actually listening to voices that were not helping you and not giving them more time in your space and in your head and choosing carefully the few people that gave you helpful answer.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like cheerleading to me. It sounds like just acknowledging the sort of the context and the suitability, this how those particular responses made sense in the context.
Would cheerleading be taking it to the next level of kind of going, and that's so strong, and that's
wow, you were so clever.
Yeah.
We start getting into identity terms, or which is one of the ways that narrative therapy can go. You can start relating these. What does that say about you as a person? About what you hold dear, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another tack we typically don't go down.
So you avoid that?
Well, we avoid kind of identity language.
Tell me why.
It can become categorical politics very quickly, and it tends to get abstract. What does this mean for what kind of a person you are? So it's kind of individualizing. Let's talk about your values. And so that can be okay, but we don't find it that helpful. I find it more helpful to remain focused on what people do, how they do that, how what they did makes sense in the context. And then once you've established with people, you have let's say an understated way of noticing those things, you may then have a position where you can come back and go, wow, man, oh man. You really take no prisoners, eh? Like you really, you've had to put up with a lot of shit and you're done with putting up with shit. Good on you, man. Like, you can come back, but again, it depends on who the person is, whether or not that's going to be valid for them.
How do you know when you're done in this work?
Well, people talk about positive changes, and we talk about, I don't know. I don't know. Sometimes, how are we going to know when it's time to fire me? Like, so there's all kinds of ways you can kind of bring it up, but basically that the key thing is reports of change, and also the nature of the relationship, and of course what people have going on in their lives, and so less is more, generally speaking. I don't want to do sort of one more session than really needs to be done. Yeah.
I know we need to end.
Yeah. Okay.
But I'm still got some questions, but I don't want to take advantage of your time.
Oh no, please go ahead.
Yeah, because you were saying before that there's sort of links with solution focused and links with narrative, and these sort of links with other theoretical approaches. I was also thinking about the not knowing position and the ways in which there are some links in the quality of the listening.
Yeah.
But not, there's certainly some knowing that's informing the questions. But I wondered if you could spell out some of those theoretical similarities and differences, kind of points of connection, points of.
Well, systemic therapy, I mean, from the systemic therapies, you're asking about interactions, relationships. So it's, in microanalysis, which is part of my background and my colleague Linda's in particular, that, it teaches you an orientation to social interaction that I think is quite particular. It teaches you a kind of an appreciation for the competency and the significance of small actions, which I think is interesting. And so, but that's, I think, consistent with a systemic approach in that you're just looking in more detail at interactions and relationships and looking at interactions in highly adverse circumstances. So there's also some differences in that interpersonal violence in some systemic approaches for many years was seen as mutual. So, for example, abusive relationships or conflicts, and that view is still quite commonplace among authorities, among very well-known people in the family violence field, for example. And so we take quite a different view. Also, we did not really go down the track of social constructionism or social constructivism too far. I would say we're practical realists. I mean, rape is not experienced as a social construction. The way in which we talk about it is, of course, constructive and interpretive, absolutely. But something real was done to something somebody very real by somebody very real in a real moment. And most of the institutions that become involved when these cases are become apparent operate on the notion of facticity. They operate on the notion that we can distinguish facts from fictions, real events from false events. So there's a different logic at work in the way that institutions practice. It's, social constructionism and constructivism. There's some value in those sort of reflective ideas about practice. But when we're thinking about practice, we take the point of view that real things do happen. We have to find the words to fit to the deeds as best we possibly can. But that's different than taking a social constructionist position on what's violent and what's not. And so there's some differences there. Narrative therapy, there's all kinds of interesting connections and differences. But when I first started focusing on responses, I was kind of like trying to do, okay, I'll externalize effects and impacts consistent with narrative therapy. But then what I found was many of the things that obviously were responses and forms of resistance were then being constructed as effects and impacts. And the person was being constructed as an object. That is, a recipient of events, not as a person responding to events. So I abandoned that practice and started to focus more on social interactions, how people actually respond, what they do, think, feel, what their body says to them, what their mind and heart says to them in a particular moment. So I just started focusing much more on the language of responses. And ultimately, I gave the term for this practice as response-based to denote that distinction. Not a great term, but at some point we had a number of core tenets and observations that hang together as a kind of a framework. And so I thought I need to at least put some sort of a word container around this to denote what it is. Solution focused, the connection there, the most direct connection is, there's the focus on what people want and their aspirations as being front and center, which I really like. And there's also, when you look at solution-focused interviews, as you know, that someone will talk about, say, being depressed, and they'll be asked a question possibly about, well, so if our work here is useful by some off chance, what will tell you that in a week from now or 2 weeks? What are some things you might notice that would be different than, oh, I might be feeling a bit more chipper. I see. And if you are, what will you be doing? I'll be walking the dog. So pretty quickly, the person goes from object to agent, from object to subject very quickly. So there's a language that I would say is parallel to the language of responses in solution focused that is introduced mindfully very quickly in the process. So that's a connection for us there. Solution focused, at least when I started studying, there was quite a bit less interest in talking about interpersonal violence, with the exception of Yvonne Dolan, notably. Some others, of course. Now there is more, which is good to see. So yeah, there's feminist and feminist-informed approaches. I think we've really taken on board a lot of the gender analysis of gender-based violence in different contexts, but also the analysis of colonial violence and how that's connected to gender-based violence and other forms of violence. So we found common cause and common language with a lot of different frameworks. And also I think we all hold this view that what we don't need is one view that is applicable to all situations. What we need is a whole family of different ways of operating and thinking so that we have more choice about thinking about how to be useful to people. Right? So, yeah.
Yeah. And we need to find what fits with us as people when we're having those conversations.
Yeah. So if I'm going to go to Ethiopia and try to work with women of Tigray who've been raped on massive levels, am I going to be asking the same questions? Do you know what I mean? I don't think so. I think there'd be differences. And I don't know what they are. Right? So I was meeting with a group from Spain the other day and just kind of saying, look, I live in a context of French and English colonialism. You live in a context of Spanish colonialism in Mexico and other, So I don't know how applicable this kind of way of thinking about colonialism is in this kind of a context. So I think it's important to be, what we're trying to not do is manualize an approach so that it could be exported as this or that from this country to that country. Because I think that's neoliberalism, that's capitalism and colonialism. It has nothing to do with being useful to people.
Alan, if I'm going to talk about you in my work, how would you like me to describe you? Like demographically, if I'm saying these were my participants.
Okay. Well, my pronouns are son, brother, husband, father, grandfather. So those are my pronouns. So I'm a European descended male who lives on unceded Indigenous territory on Turtle Island, particularly on the territory of Coetzen First Nation, and if that's the kind of information you're asking about, I would say that's probably, yeah.
You said you're from working class roots.
Yeah, I'm an adopted person from, and I was blessed with being adopted by two absolutely wonderful people, wonderful humans. My mom, on her side, is a descendant of a long line of Quakers and Mennonites who escaped Russia and then Germany and then Netherlands, and then it was Pennsylvania, Minnesota, and then they wound up in Manitoba, wheat farming in Mennonite communities there. And my mom's ethics are my ethics, I would say. My mom's ethics were, in a nutshell, everybody is important. No one is more important than anybody else. And my dad is a little bit less clear, but he, I think, has Métis ancestry, indigenous ancestry on his mother's side. I'm not positive about that, but it looks that way. And his father was a second generation settler from Scotland, and I believe their family was driven out of Scotland during the clearances, but I don't know that either. So there's kind of fierce Scots, Methodist, maybe Métis on my dad's side, Mennonite, Quakers on my mom's side. So which led to this really interesting sort of, my dad was 2 years in Europe in the Second World War, 18 months in Korea. He was a career soldier, participated in a lot of killing, saw a lot of people he loved killed, and a really, really peaceful, loving man. And two of my mother's brothers were conscientious objectors. And so I only realized after living here for about 25 years that two of my mom's younger brothers were imprisoned during the Second World War at a camp that is actually 30 kilometers from where I live, a forestry camp, as conscientious objectors. So my dad was in the military, fought in the wars. I have uncles who were conscientious objectors, And I think I can connect to both those lineages, or I hope I can. And about my biological family, I don't know very much at all. But my partner Kathy and I have 5 kids, and we have 3 kids who are adopted and 2 who are not. So the joke we always make is that adoption is hereditary in our family. So we're a bit of a mishmash, of people from all over the place. That's kind of who I am, part of that mishmash.
Are you a religious person?
No, I wouldn't say so. I would say I'm not a non-religious person. I mean, I think there's many ways of being in the world and thinking about the world, but no, I don't identify with any particular religion per se.
Curious.
Yeah. No. I mean, my mom was definitely a Christian and went to church on a regular basis. My auntie, her sister, very much the same, and her husband. My father didn't. And so, but there was no negative. I mean, those experiences were only very positive for my mom and my aunt. I was expelled from Sunday school as a child. I'm not bitter. I'm just saying. For trying to carve my name into one of the desks. So I was expelled, which, yeah, I was complaining about my school experiences before. That's sort of one side example. But anyway, no, I have a tremendous respect for people who choose to exercise their love for the rest of humanity through that means, you know?
Mm.
Yeah. How about you? How do you identify?
Well, I was smiling when you talked about your pronouns because my 4-year-old's gender is definitely contextual. So he's definitely a brother to his brother. They are two brothers, but he's definitely mum to his toys. He's very clear he's their mum. He's not their dad. He's their mum.
Yeah.
He is like it's just he has one friend that he's definitely a boy with, but then there's other, it's very much depends on in this context.
Yeah.
I am a brother
Yeah.
and a mother,
Yeah.
and I'm a son.
Yeah.
And and it's just sort of I'm very curious to see
Yeah, no kidding, eh?
happens as he grows, because his big brother is very clear that he's like a son, a brother, and he is dad to his toys. He is their dad as well. They talk about being the parents of their toys, but he's the dad, and that's clear. And his little brother is a mum.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's when you were naming pronouns in that way. That's what I was thinking about.
Yeah,
but,
I think about it relationally, contextually, not in terms of an individual identity so much.
Yeah.
But,
so I am Jewish. I grew up in a religious home, but quite a liberally religious home. So my father was a rabbi. So I grew up at the heart of a community, which has wonderful gifts and some interesting challenges at times.
Sure.
And my relationship with it now is that it's still really important to me. I have no idea what I believe, but belief is much less important in Judaism than what you do.
Okay.
And so I'm part of the community, and I go to synagogue, and that's a big part of my life.
Yeah.
The God bit, I don't know.
Yeah.
And that feels okay for now.
But the community bit,
really
belonging, really important. Yeah, absolutely.
And I've been an activist in my own community. It's been a part of my relationship with the community. Has been primarily around LGBT inclusion within the community. But I myself am heterosexual and married and able-bodied now, but I wasn't as a child.
Okay.
I was incontinent until I was a teenager, which
is
so part of my interest and experience the bullying and responses to that, and comes into my sort of personal knowing or resonance.
Yeah.
I think it's a thing to be weeing yourself into into adolescence or early adolescence.
Yeah. I think a founding experience for me, just in terms of childhood, was I remember getting into trouble at school, which I did fairly regularly. But when I was in about grade 6, and my parents got called in to have a conversation with the principal, and I remember the principal, and my parents were very intimidated by professionals. They had grade 5, and they were very just sort of, they were intimidated. And so this principal, who was angry at me, just basically humiliated them. And I remember sitting there watching that, watching this principal humiliate my parents. And I've always remembered that. And I think that has something to do with, if I think about the energy that I have for this, I think that has something to do with it.
People misusing power.
Totally. Yeah. And just the power of humiliation, which can be so rapid, and can be dressed up in so many other guises.
My grandparents, I had an interesting conversation with my mum about this. I call them all Holocaust survivors because they were all in Eastern Europe as Hitler came to power, and they all escaped. So on my mum's side, they got out earlier, in the early 30s, but most of their families were then killed. And on my dad's side, they got out just in time. So my grandmother was on the very last train out of
Wow.
Wow. My grandfather had been briefly in a camp for 3 weeks before he escaped, because barbed wires going up tomorrow, and so anyone that could escape escaped that night. But my mum said growing up they would not have called themselves Holocaust survivors, because at that point the only people that could be called survivors were the people who've been in the camps. And there's been a sort of language shift of almost recognizing that anyone who was there at that time and lived beyond it survived, because that was not, when on the side, when 90% of the Jewish community was wiped out, if you exist Polish Jew beyond that, you're a survivor. But I remember my grandmother, when she talked about it on my dad's side, and I interviewed her when I was 11 about her experiences, and I have that recording, which is nice to have. But she spoke about the sort of the moments that really seemed most painful were actually those early humiliations, or those early sort of her friend saying, "I'm not allowed to play with you anymore." And that, and and you're thinking, like, there's been so much more significant, from the outside, violence or absolutely hateful things that happened to you and your family, and sort of humiliations, those sort of degradations, dehumanizations, along the way, how those were the ones that still shook her, and then she could talk more comfortably about some of the others.
Oh, that's so interesting. I think there's room to have some good discussion about the importance of humiliation, in that it's often confused with shame, I think. In that, humiliation is something one person does to another. Shame you can experience on your own because you feel you've reacted wrongly or something. But humiliation is incredibly intense. And people respond, of course, in all kinds of ways to the experiences of humiliation. I think we don't talk about it enough, really.
No.
As a notion in our mental health practice, so to speak.
Yeah, humiliation is big.
Yeah, absolutely huge. Hey?
And I feel like nobody can have escaped an experience of it.
Yeah.
At some point in life, everyone will have a sort of a sense of what it means to be humiliated, but some people will have it so often.
Exactly. And for certain kind of reasons, such as race or whatever. And so identity. Yeah, and so most people can recall the red hot sting of humiliation.
The dissertation that I didn't write, the kind of first idea that I discarded, was to try and theorize the ways in which stories about groups get used to delegitimize their attempts at resistance.
Okay.
I've noticed things like, from a Jewish perspective, if you talk about anti-Semitism, that is evidence of your power, because you've got a platform from which people can hear you talk about anti-Semitism. So anything you say, therefore, can't really be about being oppressed, because if you're oppressed, you wouldn't have this platform. You only have this platform because you're powerful and Jewish. And so the story of Jewish power then gets used to undermine oppression. Or for Black women, the story of, you're angry, and that stereotype, then when somebody says this is happening to me and it isn't okay, the response they get is that, the sort of what comes back to them is the sort of, you're angry, come and talk to me when you're calm, helpful way to have this conversation. So, again, sort of undermining the power, or, the Trump response to the protesters with bringing out all the police, and what that communicates about you are criminal, right? And, that story that is a discriminatory bullshit story gets in an attempt to push back, then the response kind of amplifies that initial harm, that initial problematic.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, there's a book that I've recently read by Stella Doddsey, called A Kick in the Belly. And I don't know if you know who Stella Doddsey is, but she's a UK feminist who's a co-founder of Women of African and Asian Descent. And this book is beautifully written. And what she tracks the resistance of West Indian enslaved women from 1800 to about 1860 in the West Indies, and shows how their resistance was connected to and very much a part of bringing down ending slavery. But of course, not something that women are credited with much. But but more to the point that you're talking about partly is she also showed how the slavers, these quote unquote slave owners, how they represented and framed the resistance of the slaves.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course, they knew what they were getting was, but they've talked about them as being idle and malingering and unhappy and ungrateful. And the language, the character assassination just goes on and on and on again.
Yeah.
They actually had the idea that you should be able to murder, kill, abduct, rape, beat, torture these people, and then they would happily and obediently and gratefully do everything you told them to do. So it was an early example of the naming of resistance as something else.
Yeah.
And I think we've been doing that for a long, long time. The DSM is simply the latest version.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I think part of what I'm interested in is the particularity. So in that slave example, like the particularity of needing to be seen as malingering or lazy, or that sort of, that it's not the same delegitimization, right? Like it's not the same story that gets brought to undermine. You don't use the kind of Jewish power type supremacy story to undermine LGBT activists. You use a different type of story about perversion, sickness, unwell, that sort of pathologizing. But I can't, I'm still trying to figure out the language for this. I feel like there's something in that pattern. It's an interactional pattern of oppression, resistance, and then the oppression kind of coming back with force to try and suppress that resistance.
So that's the PhD you have lined up once you're done here, hey?
Yeah, exactly. With it. I don't think I don't think happy to
yes, exactly.
to look after 5 children while I do it. This has been a really wonderful conversation for me, Allan.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Lovely to meet you, Alma.
Yeah.
And please do get in touch. Let me know how you're getting on. And if you have any further questions or thoughts about anything we've discussed, I'd love to have that. So
yeah. And if you're in London, it'd be great to meet you as well.
Likewise.
Okay. All right. Part of the world.
If I swing by, I'll let you know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye for now.